If you've lived on Cape Cod or stayed here long enough, you're bound to hear about the target ship.
What most people don't know is that the reason that the target ship was given to the Navy eventually, first it was on loan and then they finally gave it to them. Why did the Navy want a target ship? It turns out that Polaroid Corporation, that I happened to work for 30 years, during the war effort, Dr. Land was a personal friend of General Patton. And he did several projects for the Army, gun sights, 3D camera system that was used to, it was used in every major invasion because it destroyed the camouflage. The 3D system could see around the camouflage, so they would know exactly what they were getting into. And he did many other projects. One of the projects he was asked for was called the Dove.
They were trying to develop a heat-seeking system for bombs. This was something they were trying to do to improve the accuracy of bombs. At the end of the war, they're just getting into kind of the missile age and these new guided weapons. There's all this new unproven technology, and this Project Dove is one of the answers they're trying to come up with for how can they improve the accuracy of these bombs they had used in the past.
During the war, the only way the American pilots could sink the enemy ships was to dive bomb on them. That was very bad for pilots. The Navy wanted an infrared guided bomb. So the whole reason that the target ship was brought down into Cape Cod Bay was to support that program.
They were trying to develop this new system where it would have some guidance and you could basically steer it or have its own sensors guide it into the target so that you hit the target more often. The SS Longstreet was what they call a Liberty ship that was built at the start of World War II. It was built and launched in October of 1942, when the U.S. had been in the war for just a little under a year. In the early years of the war for the U.S., the big problem for our country was that we did not have enough shipping to get the materials and supplies, the men and women, over towards the fighting fronts where they were needed. So the country embarked on what they called the Emergency Shipbuilding Program to start building thousands and thousands of small merchant ships that could carry all those things to where they were needed. So the Longstreet was one of those ships. It was about 7,000 tons that it could carry, travel about 11 and a half knots. So the idea was to make a lot of these very quickly and easily. So they could be built in about 42 days or so, which is pretty quick in terms of shipbuilding. And they weren't really meant to last long either. One of the, kind of almost remarkable things about the Longstreet is that it survived as a target ship because they were really only meant to live about 5 years before they fell apart. It's kind of a remarkable thing about the ship that even being used for target practice, it still outlived that. But this ship in particular had kind of a tough career, I guess you would say, in that before it was even a year old, it was involved in a collision as it was getting ready to go across the Atlantic on a convoy to Europe. It collided with another ship and got grounded on a sandbar. The Navy looked at it and decided, you know what, it's probably too dangerous to use this ship anymore as a cargo carrier. But they kind of looked at it and thought, can we use it for anything else? And they came up with the idea of using it as a target ship. When it finally comes up here to Cape Cod in April of 1945, it's brought up here specifically because of a project that they're working on with the Polaroid company in Cambridge. When going back to that Project Dove, where they're trying to attach a heat-seeking system to a bomb, and so it has to be able to somehow sense heat from a ship.
They installed, here we get between 80 and 100 heaters that are used in orchards to warn, when there's a danger of frost, they try to heat up so the fruit doesn't get damaged. So they installed some quantity of those heaters on the ship. They actually stationed, initially it was two Navy personnel. Later on it was Coast Guard personnel on the ship during the war to guard the ship, basically, because you leave something like that unguarded and it might disappear.
I do, and this is not a point of Navy pride or anything like that, but I just, because I noticed, I see a lot of articles saying that they think it was aircraft from Otis Air Force Base, that they were Air Force aircraft that were using it as a target range. I have not gone through all the records, so I couldn't definitively say. I would be very, very doubtful that the Air Force ever used that. I don't think it was planes from Otis using that, because those aircraft there had a completely different mission and a role. They were there to basically look for Soviet aircraft coming across the Atlantic and shoot them down if necessary. But those pilots were never trained in attacking enemy ships. They wouldn't have had the training or the equipment even to do that. So I'm highly skeptical they would have spent any time practicing for something that they would never have been asked to do in the real world. So I see that repeated a lot in articles. I don't think that's true. I think it was just the Navy aircraft from South Weymouth and from Quonset Point that were using it.
So the other question is, why did they choose Cape Cod Bay? Well, this target ship had been destroyed in a storm. It had grounded in New Jersey, just outside of New York Harbor, and had broken its back beyond repair. So for about a year, it was used in various target programs. But by the time the Navy got hold of the ship, they had to put 10,000 55-gallon drums in it to keep it afloat. And so the Navy looked at that. It was about 20 feet of water. It was far enough from land, so they thought that residents would not be damaged from the target practice.
So it's brought up to the bay in April of 1945. It's scuttled on Newfound Shoal on April 25th, 1945. So from that day on, it is not leaving that shoal anymore. It is there permanently. And it's used actively as a target practice up until 1970. And at the time, again, the technology was such that, the planes weren't so fast and the bombs weren't so big that they didn't feel like it was enough of a risk, or that the risk was not so high that they couldn't do it safely there. And, we, I guess, fortunately have no stories of people being, killed or seriously harmed by any of those accidental bombings. So at least, you can thank everyone for that.
During the 50s and 60s, everybody, and don't remember, the ship was actually off an East Dam shore, but anybody from Orleans or Brewster could easily see it, as well within sight, and probably Wolfleet too. So that it was the thing that you did at night, was to go down and watch the bombing.
It does seem close to the shore where civilians were, and I said today I'm sure that would be considered way, way, way too close to ever set up a live gunnery range. But because the bombs were not as powerful and because the planes weren't as fast, it was within acceptable, parameters back in those days. Another consideration, too, was that because, remember, this is a ship that's not seaworthy anymore. They had to ground it on the sandbar just so it could stay upright where the planes could target it. At that point, they couldn't have anchored it like out in the open ocean, further away from the shore, because it would have sank, right away. Or I'm sure a storm would have come in and broken it in half even sooner than it did in real life. But being inside, the protective arm of Cape Cod, where it's sheltered from the heavy seas, it was able to stay upright on that sandbar a lot longer and actually be used. So I think that was a big part of the reason about why they chose that particular location, where they thought it would at least stay intact for long enough to be useful. But I think in those days too, yeah, I mean, there was, fresh off the victory of World War II, as you said, people were certainly supportive of the military and the government. I think they were pretty trusting of, the people in charge in those days to make sure that it was done safely. So it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Wartime, they needed that ship. What happened is once the war ended, Dr. Land lost interest in the program, and he convinced Kodak actually to take over the program. So the ship was always restricted. There were always signs posted, don't go aboard, and so forth. There were actually, I think there were 4 teenagers that went out on the ship and brought back souvenirs, not knowing that some of them were in fact still alive.
I've seen some stories about, kids going out there and actually getting these bombs and taking them off and, fooling around with them. So you can see how dangerous that would be. Anytime when you shut down a site like that, and that's kind of the danger, is that you're not watching it anymore and people can go out there and climb around and do whatever on it. So it certainly becomes a danger at that point.
And the kid that lost his finger was taking a screwdriver trying to clean the mud out. So he's taking a screwdriver and a hammer, and the bomb went off, and he lost a finger. After the war was over, the Navy decided to use it to train their pilots. Because what they would do is the Navy gave them 1,000-pound bombs, which they filled with flour. There were no explosives. There was only, because the flour was white and it had the same weight and consistency as the explosives. And they would drop 2 bombs, one with the device, the infrared sensing device, and one without. And this would be from high altitude. I don't know how high, but high altitude. And so the interest was there any improvement in the infrared sensor hitting the target as compared to the one that was just dropped?
They were using practice bombs that maybe gave off a puff of smoke so they could at least see where it landed, but they weren't live. Now, some of them were, and we definitely have reports of some people on the Cape who reported, their windows were rattled and their doors were rattled by these explosions. So we know they weren't always using practice ordnance, but I think people today would be surprised that you would do that close to a civilian population. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that in those days, these explosions, the weapons were not as powerful as they are nowadays, right? I mean, you could never get away with that nowadays because modern bombs are way too powerful, and they would cause tons of damage if they exploded that close to a beach or a house. In those days, they were a little less powerful, so it maybe was not quite as dangerous as it would be today.
There were single-engined, propeller-driven aircraft that would come down from the various Navy bases for pilot training. And that's what almost everybody remembers, is the bombing of the ship by these pilots. And they had switched to jets. And they were using machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns. They were using rockets and all kinds of different armament on it. So people have souvenirs of a lot of like the 50 caliber shell casings and stuff like that. And as far as I know, no one was ever arrested or asked to leave. The fishermen, of course, my dad included, would use that for lee at night. Rock Harbor is a tidal harbor. You have to come and go on the high water. So you might have to go out at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're not going to start fishing until daylight. So you would go up and tie up to the ship and use it as a lee. You never knew when the planes were coming. So on many occasions, they would always did a dry run over the ship. You would have to wake up, get underway, and get out of there. But the planes never ever flew over the boat. They would change as your course progressed away from the ship. They would change their course so that they never flew over you. My dad at that time, because he was still fishing, every day he had to go to the Coast Guard station, tell them where he was going to go, how long he was going to be there. And then when he came in, he had to go back to the Coast Guard station and tell them that he was ashore. There weren't that many fishermen. So yes, everyone had to do it, yeah. The Navy personnel were assigned to guard the docket ship because they didn't want anyone fooling with the heaters or stealing the oil, the diesel oil.
That's kind of the problem by that point. The jets are even faster, the bombs are more powerful, and so at that point you just can't use a target that's that close to a civilian population anymore. So that's one of the reasons it gets shut down by 1970, yeah.
And the same thing with the rockets that they used. So that if they missed the ship, they had basically no idea where the rockets or the bullets were going to end up. Obviously, they always went from the land toward the ship. So anything they went out into the bay. Before they brought it in, they had stripped it. The Navy had stripped it. Now, that's another story. They left a lot of stuff on the ship. But what I do know is that there was a fellow, I have to be careful, I don't want to be sued here, that had a junkyard, and he had a large boat. And one summer long, you could see his acetylene torch cutting scrap metal off the ship, which obviously he was selling as scrap metal. And he did that all summer long. So when everyone got done, trust me, there wasn't much left on the ship.
Tommy had a unique reputation. And one day there was stuff. We used to go out and Tommy would go out and gather up, stuff that he could get off of the boat. I mean, there was, the Navy, or the Longstreet had a whole bunch of brass and bronze and stuff that had some value to it. And Tommy's dad was a junk dealer. And Tommy went out and gather stuff, and we were out there one day. And Tommy was up in the mast was, everything was up then, and Tommy was up in the crow's nest gathering something up there when Navy showed up on a strafing run. And Tommy dove, Jeff will tell you, there isn't a whole lot of water out there. I jumped over the side. Tommy dove off of the crow's nest into the thing. The plane, I'm not sure whether the pilot saw us or not, because I don't recall any, and they used live ammunition. I mean, it wasn't like, it wasn't like they were, going to toss some jelly beans over the side.
Allegedly. I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but he was a famous writer from Wellfleet who wrote a story about the fact that I believe it was in November, his friend said to him, like at 10 o'clock at night, "You have to take me out to the ship." So it was blowing northwest, it was cold, it was at night. They went out to the ship, the guy climbed up the ship, and here again, they would use the bomb holes as stepping spots to climb up in the ship. There were no ladders or anything. And after about a half an hour, he came back with his arms loaded with funny-looking plants. So not only was it a restricted area, property belonging to the U.S. government, but he was raising marijuana on the ship.
Yeah, some of the stories you read about, people growing, plants and marijuana on it, or just digging around. The major problem, I think, for the Navy is that there's still unexploded bombs out there. Not some of these bombs they've dropped did not explode. That kind of always happens over time. And so They put a buoy out there to let boaters know there is unexploded ordnance in this area. Be careful, it's a dangerous area.
During my time, what was used was a 12-inch cast iron bomb with a smoke charge basically in it. And when it hit the ship, it would make a bright flash so the pilots could see if they'd hit their target. And by the way, the pilots took about 3 weeks for them to be trained. They would come in and fly horizontally and miss the ship by a mile. At the end of 3 weeks, they would come in and dive bomb it and hit it almost every time. Now those were small cast iron bombs, and what would happen is the pilot would hit the release button, my theory, and they would get stuck in the chute. So as the plane circled, they would tip up to make the turn, and the vibration of the aircraft would shake those bombs loose. So I know because I grew up next door here, I knew that there were some of those bombs that fell in the field across from our house. Later on, they switched to much heavier bombs, 100-pound bombs and so forth. And there were many reports of near misses of those bombs and so forth. I do know the pilots were instructed not to fly over a house and not to fly over a boat, because officially I believe it's 1,000-yard circle, radius of 2,000 yards that is restricted. No one is supposed to be within that circle. The Coast Guard in Portland were charged with enforcing that.
Saltwater and rust continued to carry out the demise of the vessel. In a few years, the bow section was the only piece left standing.
They dropped sandbags, on their bombing runs, and they had bags, canvas bags filled with sand, because they didn't want to blow the thing up. That was their target. But there was a lot of sand that got dropped, on there. The bullets, their strafing runs, that was real ammunition. And but I think that they were, I'm guessing that their bombing practices, they couldn't really drop real bombs because they'd just blow the ship up and then they wouldn't have a target anymore.
That's, something that most ranges that are further away on like inside a base are well marked so that people know not to go there. When it's a range like this, that's out where, people can go and fishing ships can go. Obviously, more protection, more measures have to be used to make sure that people know about the danger that's there. That would be considered quite a big deal in today's world, and as it should be, right? And that's the danger of any gunnery range. Whenever you're firing ordnance of any kind, there will be some percentage of it that doesn't go off or doesn't explode, and you're going to have those unexploded rounds out there. So
I think during a wartime, those are not really serious considerations. All bets are off. It was, people now go down to watch the sunset. People would go to the beach and watch the bombing. It was the biggest attraction on the Cape. Every night, the beaches were crowded with people sitting there watching the bombing. It was exciting. And bear in mind, it was 3 miles offshore, so that it was far enough from land that there was really no danger, other than the fact of these bombs that didn't release properly. That's my theory, anyhow.
I know there are people in the area, if you were around in the 50s and 60s, I've certainly heard stories of people who remember, going out there to the beach at night, and it's almost treating it like a fireworks show. They kind of set up their coolers and bonfires, and they bring the kids out, and they say, "Ooh, look at the bombs." And then they watch these Navy jets come over and strafe the ship, and it's big entertainment for them, right? And there are... Most of those practice runs, I will say, those aircraft were not using live ordnance. that point on up until it's in 1996 when the storm blows in and breaks the ship up and it finally sinks below the waves where it's not even visible anymore. But at least from 1970 to 1996, it's still visible, even though the Navy's not using it as a target anymore.
So it's still today, it's still there. It's just below the water.
The Navy, I did see the Navy gave two, official reasons for why they were stopping it. One was the proximity to civilian populations and the fact that the technology had progressed to the point where it was just too dangerous to do these tests that close to where people were. And the second reason was just that the ship itself wasn't really useful to conduct these tests. By the time the 1970s are around, it's not Navy aircraft are not attacking ships with bombs. They're basically, the missile is the weapon that really is the one that the Navy uses that they would attack another ship with. As far as, what is done after 1970 to mark it and guard it, I mean, I know it's marked on charts. Obviously, it's a well-known navigation hazard. Boaters, even if they're not wanting to go explore it, they need to know it's there because it's obviously can put a hole in the bottom of their boat if they're not careful about, sailing directly over it. So it's certainly marked with charts and buoys. Ship is under the water, it's sunk now. It remains U.S. Navy property. I think for me, because I work in a museum and we deal with historic artifacts, for me, it's one of these, interesting stories that ties local, it ties people to a larger national story, right? It's kind of a piece of local history that's tied into the larger story of the U.S. Fighting in World War II, building ships, and then the Cold War that comes after it, and trying to train their pilots to operate in an environment like that. But it's this kind of quirky piece of local history that really ties into that and gives people something that, I think a lot of Cape Cod people I've talked to almost sound proud of it, the fact that it was there and it was used for so long and that it was something that only they got to see. Nobody else along the East Coast had something like this that they could go out there and see. We in Cape Cod had this kind of cool ship out there. It's not the kind of thing, again, because of how close it was, I don't think that's anything that the Navy would ever do today. And as we talked about, there were reasons why they were okay setting it up back then, but you would never see something like that today. And so I think it's kind of a unique piece of history that is past that we won't ever see again.